Hello, everybody here and on Zoom. My name is Nathan Whaley. I'm becoming the St. Francis in 2019. Obviously, it was breaking person during COVID, during 2020 through 2021. I served in the United States Army from 2008 to 2013 as an airborne infantry. If you don't know what that means, you may have heard the term parachute. It's the same thing. Basically, our job historically was jump behind enemy lines, out of planes, and fight our way to an objective. While I did have 18 jumps, all those were training, so I did not do that in a combat environment. The fighting, on the other hand, very much in the DNA of paratroopers. Deployed twice to Afghanistan, once in 2010 and once in 2012.
No, it's Nathan. No, it's Nathan's.
You just confirm it, you're being recorded.
Yeah, it's funny. There we go. That's so weird. Go there. You're not smart enough.
Sorry about that. Okay. I'm going to speak to you today about my time in the Army, my experiences in Afghanistan, how that affected my faith and brought me to St. Francis, and touch on Afghan refugees with me. I've never spoken to a group about my service. I hope I can give you a taste of what being in a combat role in the military is like. Just so you know, these experiences, the issues, my successes are not mine alone. All infantry soldiers go through similar things. My goal is not to glorify my service, but to give you an insight into a world you may not understand. If at any point in time you have questions, please ask. When I first made this presentation, I was worried about it being too short. As it came together, I realized it might be too long. So there are a few sections we're going to skip initially. And if there's time at the end and people want to talk about that, we'll go back. Okay. So if I skip forward or something. So why does somebody in my generation join the military? What are some reasons people think we join the military?
I don't learn a job.
For a job, 9/11. Okay. What's that? Structure.
Good benefits.
Benefits. Those are all pretty good reasons. All good reasons. So
Family history. That's why my husband did.
it's like you read the presentation.
No, it's actually, I did, but those are the two reasons my husband joined the Air Force.
Yeah.
Family history, he was following in his father's footsteps, and we could afford to get married because the Air Force covered part of his tuition.
How do you think that differs when you're joining specifically to fight, considering every single person in my generation joined after 9/11? We knew we were going to war, with the exception of if you joined after September of 2021. So how do you think that differs, knowing you're going to war and you're volunteering to do so?
Calls the enlistment probably, right? People have to be serious about facing the battle.
Could be.
I think you have to be committed.
Yep. Okay. All good. Anybody on Zoom? I don't know if I'm missing hands up or okay. And I apologize, I'm looking at my screen a lot. I tend to go on tangents if I don't. Okay. My generation of soldiers seem to have a lot of reasons they joined. Some joined because they wanted to be able to pay for college. Some were court ordered to join and go to jail. Some felt a sense of duty and honor of generations in military service. And sadly, others had a death wish and they thought combat could be that. I joined because in my third year of college, I was bored, looking for something crazy to do. I was not doing great in school. I didn't have a lot of motivation to finish a degree. I was young and wanted to do something reckless and crazy. I have stories later. It was during the surge in Iraq. I knew I would go to war. But ever since 9/11, I felt a sense of wanting to go to the fight and be responsible for this country and be responsible for helping this country.
I'm going to sit by you. Sorry, because some people on Zoom can't hear as well.
Okay.
So I'm going to see if having two microphones helps. And they
Okay.
asked if you could slow down just a little bit.
Okay. I grew up in a very patriotic house, so it wasn't a big stretch for me to think that I needed to go defend America.
I felt the military could kind of give me all of these. Here's where we kind of start skipping a few things. So I skipped forward to arriving at my first unit. All right. That skips basic training and all that good stuff. But I was assigned to the 173rd Airborne for my first unit, which is stationed out of Italy. So I arrived in Italy and was taken to the base from the liaison office in the airport. And the first thing you have to do is report to the battalion sergeant major. So the conversation was very brief, kind of mumbled, hey, go over to HHC, see if they want you. So I walked over to the HHC building.
Headquarters and headquarters command.
Sorry, it's a company in the battalion. And when I arrived there, I was reporting to the first sergeant, and he looked at me and said, what do you think about being in the sniper platoon? I said, oh, that sounds really cool. Let's do it, right? So the thing is, like, I had to try out for that unit. There's only one sniper and reconnaissance platoon in an entire battalion. So to break that down, a battalion may have 2,000 people. My platoon had 30. So of that, anybody who wanted to try out, of the 2,000 people, anybody could try out. And those who made it. Those who didn't went back to their normal company. So I reported to the platoon sergeant for the sniper platoon, who told me I could hang out with 3rd Squad, but tryouts would determine if I stayed in. Tryout wasn't all that hard. There's a PT test, which I maxed out. I was pretty good at all the physical training. Some target identification exercises like they do in sniper school. Some radio exercises, more physical training, and an interview. Once it was official, I was on the team and I was assigned the position of radio telegraph operator for a 6-man sniper squad.
See this thing here?
And the whole reason I was assigned to be the radio was, and I quote, you're
That's a
kind
lot
of nerdy, so you can
This is
figure this
a
stuff
lot of
out.
words in here, and this is how I
No
can-
wonder you fit at St. Francis.
Yeah. So if anybody has ever worked with radios in general, you can imagine the Army radios are even more complicated because we have ComSec that we have to put in there to make sure that people can't hear us talking and various things. And they can be a pain. They're not fun. So I was also cross-trained on long distance shooting techniques as well by the people who were sniper qualified so that we could all be backup shooters because they can't spend all day behind the glass. So we have to rotate in and out. It was right about that time that we all received orders to Afghanistan, and immediately things changed. The day that happened, the mood kind of changed around everybody. Things became more serious, training ramped up. We were in the field as much as we could. We started using gas masks when we were running and doing physical training because we knew we were going to be in the mountains and we wanted to limit oxygen. And we started our mindset training. So what kind of qualities do people think the modern warrior needs for the fight that we were in? Okay, think outside the box. Calm under pressure. Okay,
Situational awareness.
situational awareness is huge.
The bad guys aren't lined up in big squares all road up.
No, unfortunately, it's pretty easy to find them, or pretty hard to find them right now. That would have been much easier, right? Much more scary because you're 20 yards from each other the way you used to fight, right? So, in my opinion, the modern warrior, just like past warriors, needs to be able to harness a level of violence and brutality and use that towards the enemy. A lot of people don't think about that, right? In Hollywood, everything's glorified. Battle is, they don't show the bad parts. There's over 250 jobs in the Army, but only a handful are combat related. Less than 1% of the United States will serve in the military. And about 1%, sometimes 5%, depending on what's needed through the Army, will serve in combat MOSs. And MOSs is what we use to say job in the Army. The infantry isn't about being able to carry a bunch of weight, although it's important. It's about deploying a mindset where you're kind of okay with killing people. It seems very foreign to modern civilized people, which is why the military basically needs to brainwash you into it. It's called a combat mindset. There are a few things the Army does such as they switch from bullseye targets to what we call E-type silhouettes, which are in the shape of a human when we do our target shooting. This kind of gets you used to shooting at a person-shaped target. They found that during World War II, a lot of people would shoot, but they wouldn't shoot at a person. They didn't feel morally great about doing it. So they're trying to trick your brain, basically, all right? They also introduced violence early in the form of combatives training. Throughout basic training and the entire time you're in the military, especially when you're in the infantry, you're working combatives training, you're doing boxing, MMA, you're bringing out pugil sticks. We used to keep boxing gloves in our company area. If you had a disagreement with anybody, you just walked out to the wood line, you had a quick match and you figured it out. Everything was geared towards fighting.
It's boxing gloves.
This kind of weeded out the weak as
Boxing
well.
gloves.
If you feared fighting and you wouldn't get in line, they just placed you at a desk job. It wouldn't let you back in. It also meant being able to be calm when the enemy brings violence against you. We work on this with battle drills, which give us a set response to certain situations. You do these constantly until it becomes second nature. So when you may freeze up in your mind, your body just kind of goes into autopilot and fights back. Lastly, they try to desensitize you to death and gore. Most of the seasoned guys have already developed a very dark sense of humor, and that gets pushed down on you guys. The whole culture and unit is to laugh at death, laugh at pain, be the tough guy, not show weakness. And this never stops. It's a constant process where the seasoned soldiers become less and less bothered by death. There are times when leaders try to shield their lower enlisted from horrific experiences because they can't handle it yet. I know when I was a sergeant, we always try to take the lead. You always see if there's something that you don't think your lower enlisted can handle because they haven't seen it yet, you try and shield them from it. And it's great when that happens, but other times it can't happen. And bad things happen. You know, that's when you start getting people who might not be able to handle a situation and they freeze up and they get PTSD, things like that. So getting to Afghanistan was a lot of jumping around type of movements. We left our base from Italy. We went to another base in Italy. From there, we flew into Kyrgyzstan. We had to wait a few days for the next flight. Bounced around and ended up flying into Bagram Airfield, which was the largest base at the time in Afghanistan, located next to Kabul. As we were landing, one thing I remembered, it was at night, there's no lights to be seen. Normally, when you fly into a city, you'll see buildings, you'll see lights, things like that. And there was nothing. I found this odd at the time. Once we were on the ground, we immediately went into a large assembly room for an initial briefing in the area. And the walk from the plane to the building wasn't very long, but I started noticing some odd smells. More on that in a minute. Several briefings later, we grabbed our bags, headed to a tent to get some sleep. In the morning, I woke up, went out to the shuttle to head to the chow hall. While I was on the shuttle, it's a pretty long drive around Bagram to get to certain areas. And I noticed huge mountains, sporadic green areas in the distance, a lot of brown dirt, rocks on the other side of the fence, farmers using basic hand tools to work various crops. There's not a lot of livestock and almost no heavy equipment. The only buildings I could see were basic one-story mud huts. And I also noticed signs on the porta potties that I later found out had Pashtun written on them, basically telling people to not dip their hands in the water to wash them. All right. I found that odd. You guys may find that odd. But you got to realize, especially in the rural areas of Afghanistan, there were no sewers. They would just wash their hands in creeks, things like that. They saw water, they thought they could wash their hands in it. Porta potties were kind of a foreign concept to some people. So back on the smell, the two odors in the country that I've realized you can kind of tell a difference from. One came from the burn pits. I don't know if anybody have heard of the burn pits over when we were deployed. We would burn everything: plastics, batteries, food waste, dunnage, which is things from ammunition that are left over, like casings and things like that. A lot of this was toxic to breathe in and has caused issues environmentally and with soldiers and things like that. But at the time, really not much else we could do. Those things can be stuffed with explosives, used against us, things like that. So we had to kind of limit what we were giving people the ability to use. I also came to find out that the dust in the country was 60% fecal matter. See, as I said, a lot of areas don't have sewage disposal. So human waste was kind of left in the open to dry. It would crumble and get into the dust. While that wasn't pleasant, it was still better than the burn pits. First impressions. So our main area of operation was outside of Wardak province in rural areas out there. Took a few days to get out to the AO, but once we did, we were immediately out of missions. Our second mission was in an area called the Tangi Valley. We were out providing overwatch to ground troops and going through various small villages in the valley to talk to elders, trying to gather intel on Taliban movements. Looking around, I noticed there's no telephone poles bringing electricity in, no lights around the buildings. All the buildings are kind of one story. You might see a little bit taller building here and there. They're all made of mud, and it's very, very different landscape. I would later find out that the villages normally only had like one generator that was typically used for their well waters or their mosques. It started to hit me what kind of poverty these people actually live in. It was also that mission that our sniper started to get a little worked up and said, "What the heck? Whaley, look at this, look at this." Kind of hit me on the leg. And so I turned around quickly, trying to see what was causing the commotion. I thought we were about to get in a fight. I was excited. What I saw was what appeared to be a 70-year-old woman, armpit deep in a 4-foot tall pile of manure, grabbing armfuls and putting it through a sifter. She was then shaping them into dinner plate-sized chunks and throwing them onto the roof to dry out. I asked our interpreter about this, and he told me that's what they burn in their house to cook on and for heat. It made sense because there's not a lot of trees around to cut down for firewood. They had to do everything they could. Quite the interesting initial impression out there. Quickly into the deployment, we were in our first contact. And to be honest, it was kind of a letdown. We were on the side of a tall mountain providing overwatch to ground troops and looking for some specific high-value targets. Apparently, someone figured out where we were and started shooting at us. It wasn't machine gun fire, just one shot every 30 seconds or so. We call these pop shots. Essentially, what they would do is test us, see if we'd go running, see if we could fight. We didn't move. In fact, we didn't move at all. But the round started kind of getting close and close enough to where my sergeant told me to scoot over. So I scooted over a few feet and they stopped. Our sniper did get to engage a spotter we kind of identified, but that was it. I kept thinking all this crazy training, all the mental prep just for a few shots. Is this what a firefight is now? This is dumb. I didn't realize at the time it was cold weather. The Taliban don't really come out to play very much in cold weather. It wasn't fighting season yet. Things were boring, in my opinion, until that started. During the slow time when it was cold and it wasn't fighting season, we would try and interact with the locals as much as we could. Our purpose was to gain their trust so they could help us in the fight. They could tell, they could kind of tell us where people were, who wasn't part of that village, how they were coming in there, things like that. This wasn't a very easy sell in that area, though. The locals didn't really want war in their valley. Who would, right? What I found interesting is they didn't care what side won. We were told we're the good guys. We were told, oh, we're going there to liberate the people. They didn't care. They just wanted one side to win and go out. When we would talk to them about their government, they would have no clue what we were talking about. It was an election year, so we were trying to campaign to get people out to vote. And they would just tell us, well, we just follow what our elders tell us. What's a president? I have no idea what a president is. I don't know what you're talking about to us. Another thing that I kind of noticed when we were walking around and talking to people is nobody was overweight. Notice in the picture of all the Afghan locals here, everybody looks pretty skinny, right? They didn't have enough food to be overweight. They had to work very hard in their fields just to make ends meet. They would take groceries and various things they would make to a market to barter and maybe sell. But there wasn't a lot of money to be had anywhere in that area. Even though they were extremely poor by US standards, they always offered us tea and bread when we went to their house. This was part of a Pashtun code that everybody followed. I felt bad taking this from them sometimes, but it was looked as bad if we didn't. It looked like we weren't appreciative of them if we didn't. So we would take it, we'd be very thankful. They would do these things even as the Taliban threatened everybody who would help to talk to us. They were very poor people, and they would still give us things they were low on, even when threatened. It made some of us realize just how good we have it at home. And it also gave us an appreciation for people over in that area. As spring started, the fighters came out of the woodwork. We started getting into more and more fights with heavier gunfire and received indirect mortar attacks quite frequently. Our first large fight was twofold. We had 2 teams in the valley with 2 teams in Overwatch. The teams in the valley got ambushed while moving back to the base. They started receiving incoming machine gun fire and RPGs. Both the teams on the ground and in Overwatch returned fire. Finally, this is the fight we were trained for. This is what we wanted. From that day forward, almost every mission outside that we would go out of our base and outside the wires, we called it, involved some type of shooting. Taliban also started shooting mortars and RPGs and rockets into our base weekly. They actually got pretty good at it. We were on a base that was smaller than this church. And so if you can imagine, we're there and rockets hitting and mortars hitting, they got pretty good at it. But, you know, we had bunkers and things like that. This all kind of led to a peak of fighting during election day, which was in the midsummer. So the Taliban did not recognize the power in Afghanistan. They did not recognize the government there. And they didn't want anybody voting during an election for officials that they deemed not legitimately in power. Because of this, they pushed hard to scare people off. 2 weeks before election day, we were out and heard from locals that the Taliban were going around to people and telling them that they were going to kill them if they went to the polling sites. They're spreading anti-government propaganda, using fear tactics, and telling locals to let us know that they would attack us as well. Of course, we just took this as a challenge. Paratroopers, we never backed down from the fight. I woke up at 7 a.m. on election day to my team leader telling me to get my stuff on and be ready. We were tasked as the quick reaction force for the entire battalion area of operation. And we were planning to just go where we were going to be needed. Not realizing that every polling place was under attack, every unit outside the wire was under attack, and every single person was calling for quick reaction force. The only question was, who needed us most? After a long debate, we hopped on a helicopter, went out to help. And after a long day of fighting, we returned back to refit and get ready for the next day. We started getting intel reports of some ballot boxes in this valley called the Chalk Valley that could not be picked up. The Taliban was guarding it, not letting locals or ANA around it. So we actually went out there 3 times to try and get it, and every time the helicopters would land, they would have mortars right on us. It took 130 soldiers total, 100 on the ground in my 30-man platoon up in the mountains, 3 days of intense fighting, 2 resupplies of bullets and water to retrieve the ballot boxes. After that, the fighting was pretty steady, but not as intense. We started to become desensitized to bullets going past our head, and a lot of us would wait till 2 or 3 went by to decide to take cover. The reason for that is we had a lot of gear on. It's not easy to move. It sucks to go down, get on the ground, and then have to stand back up. Our average weight that we were carrying was about 100 to 120 pounds.
Jeez.
So unless it was a real threat.
Knees are blown out.
Yeah, knees, ankles, hips, backs. I mean,
Yeah.
but that's why we didn't wait until we knew it was a real threat. Sometimes they'd only shoot at you once and then you just kind of go about your day. And also with incoming, if we heard a mortar or something explode, but we didn't think it was really close to us, we wouldn't even get out of bed. In hindsight, it was kind of a terrible thing, but at the time we just didn't care. When our tour was drawing to a close, we started leaving the bases and headed back to Bagram to leave for home. After our first 2 legs back, we ended up at Forward Operating Base Shank. This is the first time in months we had decent food. Most of our food where we were at was MREs, the meals ready to eat. And sometimes we would get hot chow. Most of the time we couldn't get hot chow because they couldn't get us resupplies of water to be able to cook the food. Those resupplies would get blown up a lot trying to come into us. So we were extremely happy. In fact, our first big meal was midnight chow. This was a thing because a lot of units would go on reverse schedules and be up at night instead of during the day so they could do their movements at night. At midnight chow, they would have breakfast and dinner food. So since this was our first big meal, I took 2 plates, one of breakfast, one of dinner. So not quite halfway through, a rocket hit the middle of the base. Everybody in the chow hall, which at the time there's probably about 150 people in the chow hall, scattered for the bunkers, except for 6 of us from my platoon. Everybody didn't even look up from their plates and just mumbled, "Not close enough," and kept eating. A few minutes later, a first sergeant ran in and yelled at us for not getting to bunker. So now we had to go since he was ordering us. I quickly just scarfed down the food off of one plate, grabbed the second plate, and started walking to the bunker. And apparently nobody at that base had ever seen anybody so interested in food. I ended up gaining 15 pounds on the 2 weeks or so that it took us to get back to Italy. And we were working out 2 to 3 times a day, even when we were not at Bagram and everything leading back. So most of it was muscle. But before then, we just couldn't even get enough calories to gain weight. We could finally take a hot shower every day, which was not a luxury we had in the rural areas. At one point in time, I went 6 months without a shower. And we had nice, good, clean drinking water. As I said before, one of the things that would hinder us from getting hot chow was getting water resupplies. The water we had, we couldn't really cover. We didn't have a lot of space, so we'd sit out in the sun and bake, even though on the bottle of water it says to not put it in the sun. And sometimes we'd run out and we have to drink the well water, which was not good. So it was great.
Not good for your gut.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So it was great. And once we touched down in Italy, I figured everything would be puppy dogs and lollipops. How could it not? We weren't deployed anymore. I was wrong. What do you guys think are some of the issues coming home for soldiers? What do you think it's like for a soldier to come home from combat? What's something that could pop in your minds?
Reality flip.
Okay, boring, reality check. What was over here?
Lonely.
Lonely. Okay. All good answers.
Disconnected to regular life people.
Yep.
Nobody gets you.
Yep.
Nobody gets you, just repeating.
Yep. So
I suspect you get addicted to that adrenaline.
very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. These are all great answers. They're all stuff that I have right here in my notes that I'm gonna explain to you guys.
Let's invite anybody from Zoom.
I didn't see any hands.
Anybody from Zoom? Yeah, Donna?
Not sure.
Oh, you're muted now. Oh, Donna, you're muted.
Okay, it would be like a culture shock. I'm still muted.
No, you're there.
Okay, never mind.
Culture
I heard
shock.
it.
Oh,
Well,
yeah,
we weren't coming home to the United States. We were going back to Italy, which, yes, it's a civilized society and everything, but there are differences, right?
Yeah.
So one thing is that paratroopers never say they're hurt. They'll feel pain, depression, anger, other ailments. They'll never admit it. It takes catastrophic events for people to get help, and sometimes it's too late. Returning from deployment is supposed to mean that you're out of danger. You can relax. You can enjoy yourself. What really happened is people had a hard time sleeping. They felt hypervigilant. They had anger issues because when deployed, being angry helped you fight. So it's almost a survival mechanism. Those who had lost friends had survivor's guilt with no idea how to deal with that. Admitting these things was looked as weakness. Nobody talked about it. They would turn to alcohol and drugs to suppress the anger and depression. Time magazine called them the second unit I was in, the most athletic alcoholics in the world. It's looked at as a joke, but never try and outdrink a paratrooper. It's not going to happen.
Mm.
Every night there's some kind of fight out at the bars or on post. It became normal to see the guys with broken noses, fat lips, cuts, bruises, a broken hand from a bar fight. Fighting was our normal, and we felt out of place in peaceful Vicenza. We missed the adrenaline of fighting, so we created it. Most of the time, this was with civilians. We wouldn't fight each other because we formed a very tight bond overseas. These weren't small scraps either. People were using bottles as weapons. Guys would get arrested. Our chain of command had no idea how to stop this. People were going to the hospital. Some of us were able to eventually calm down. Others haven't to this day. There's still soldiers that I talk to that, you know, they're out in bar fights. They still can't cope with those they've lost. They won't go get help. They don't know to get help.
Nathan, how did you do it?
I think I just got lucky. I had a really good support system with family and friends. I think a lot of people also, when they get out, and we'll kind of go over this more later on, they get out because they don't feel like they want to be in the Army anymore, but they get out and they fall into bad habits. I happened to get out, and because part of it was that I met my lovely wife, and she would smack me upside the head and keep me in line.
I always find it a matter of curiosity, and of course during World War II, like the majority of young men ended up going off to battle, and somehow they managed to come back. And it's not that a lot of them didn't have scars, but
Yeah.
they seemed to build a normal world somehow after all of that. And that's really weird that that worked out as well.
Well, and one thing that so I'm involved in the 173rd Airborne Association, and most of those guys are all Vietnam vets. It's interesting to compare and contrast coming back, because for us coming back, everybody applauds us. Everybody wants to help us. Even though the VA is slow to help, there's more services that can be provided once you get ratings now than there ever has been. The Vietnam vets, the Korean War vets, the World War II vets, we go back all the way to the Civil War, Revolutionary War. Everybody suffered similar things. They were angry, they were depressed, they felt bad that they lived and others didn't, things like that. Audie Murphy kind of talked a lot about some of that stuff and the shell shock and things like that they used to call it.
They have different names for it.
Yeah, and so it is interesting to think that previous generations were able to cope a little bit better. And I don't know why that was. I don't know if maybe there's a better family structure.
Or
you hear about a lot that they would never talk to their families. Right.
And that's true. My grandpa, he fought in the 82nd, he fought in North Africa, he jumped into Sicily. I mean, and he was infantry, so he was the same job I was. And he told me funny stories. We found out when he was going through a lot of troubles in his 80s, we were trying to get him some VA benefits. He had 8 Bronze Stars. I mean, we have no idea what for.
also, everybody went through it.
Yeah,
Like everybody had military service, so there was a common ground.
that's true.
Every mother had sent a son. I mean, I'm just sitting here, Nathan's mom's in the back corner, and I'm sitting here listening to this story as his pastor, but thinking, dear God, if this was Mark telling me that he was picking the plate of food over getting to the bunker, I'd be smacking him upside the head. But everybody had that shared experience, and now there isn't that common framework. But I also want to point out that the COs didn't know what to do, and Madeline knew just how to kick ass. So.
No, that's true. It is interesting. I'll kind of go over this when I go over getting out of the Army and kind of coming to St. Francis and things like that. But there is a disconnect between those who have served and civilians. And there's even a little bit of disconnect between those who served in like an infantry world and those who did not and weren't out there with us. There are support jobs that were at the same bases as us. We always needed mechanics, we needed refuelers, we needed intel people, we needed supply, different things like that. So they have some of the shared experiences, but there's a lot of others that did not do that. And that's not to diminish their service to this country at all. It's just a different way that they served in different experiences. So it's even kind of hard to relate to some people, even though they've been in the military. So when you get out, you can't really go talk to everybody. And I think that's maybe one thing that helped during World War II, like you were saying in Vietnam, is there are so many people that they went and helped. The other thing is after World War II and all these others, that's when things like VFW halls were created. You had American Legion halls, you had unit associations. And so a lot of these vets would get together in very large quantities and talk. If you go now, VFW halls they're not very populated. It's still probably going to be probably not so much World War II guys now, but the Vietnam guys, there's not a lot of my generation joining these because I think they feel a little disconnected to them. Even in my association, I'm one of 3 people from my generation of soldiers. So that association is probably going to die once the Vietnam vets are kind of gone, if we can't recruit. So again, there's a lot of different mechanisms and a lot of different changes in the country that may have contributed to people having a different way of coping now than they did before. So thanks for bringing that up, because it is an interesting way to look at it, that there's a lot of people that did a lot of fighting in different ways that they've coped. So
Well, and looking at the theme of this series of thinking about through the lens of refugees, like we're talking about what it is to experience that in a finite period and be able to come home to a loving support network. What is it to live in it always, generation after generation?
yeah, I mean, obviously we were there over 20 years. I mean, there's people that were born that knew nothing but war.
There are also, long wars, whether we're involved or not, there are generations who never, ever become educated, yet, learn how to read, learn how to count beyond 10, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And that is one thing to bring up. In the rural areas where we're at, they would have what we call madrasas. They weren't really schools. They were kind of church-led schools. So you had either an elder or you had a religious leader that would teach these. If they were highly educated, and by highly educated in that area, they could count, they could read, and things like that, that was great. And they would pass that down to the generations. If they weren't, they would pass down what they knew. So you might have teenagers and things like that coming over here that are supposed to be going to high school that can't read, can't write, things like that. And that's going to be very big. And we'll get into some of that
Wasn't
here.
This recent generation, the most educated in such a long time, the girls, some schools were opening for them. So this past 20 years, didn't you have a lot more sophistication again?
So yes, but you got to realize it's a relative term.
Okay.
Their education system was nowhere near formal. It's just that like girls could go to school. They could go to these madrasas, whereas before they would be severely punished and the parents would be severely punished if that happened. That's also not everywhere in the country. If the Taliban had a stronghold there, they would rule the way that they did. So like my second deployment that we'll go over here was in an area where the Taliban had that control over that area. So none of that had happened at that time.
Certainly this generation had a lot more freedom and liberty than past generations. And
Yes, but again, you get
hard to have that ripped away.
yeah, and you also got to realize that is it's a relative term. They've never experienced the freedoms and liberties that we have here. Yeah.
Well, and about foreign invasion. I mean, because before us, it was Russia, and before that, it was Britain, and
Yeah.
before that, and before that,
Yeah.
and before that.
Yep.
But just want to,
Yeah.
15 minutes.
So I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit here because so to give a brief synopsis, I had PCS, which is Permanent Change of Station, out of Italy to the 82nd Airborne in Fort Bragg. I was one of the only people that had seen a combat experience, so they promoted me pretty quick, and I was in charge of 3 soldiers now. So when we got to Afghanistan, we took us a little bit to get to the province, but once we got there, we met up with our Afghan army and police counterparts. All right. We were going to an area where the Taliban held the territory. There was a Polish base that we were kind of taking over, but they didn't actually patrol. In fact, the Taliban still flew their flag in the marketplace. So we got there, we met up with the Afghan army and the Afghan police, and the thought was we would take the area, We would hand it over to them and they would hold it. Once we started working with them, we realized just how poorly trained and equipped they actually were. They didn't understand battle drills. They didn't understand fighting really to our standards. And I don't necessarily blame them. One of the things that you got to realize is these guys, since there's no money in the area, some of these guys were just joining the army of the police because that's the only way they could get paid. They weren't fighting in the district or province that they were from. So because everything's so split and tribal, like they didn't really care about that province, and they didn't necessarily care about the Taliban. So it's really, really hard to get them to want to fight. And I realized I was on the wrong slide. So if you notice, like all those guys are Afghans in the background there. So since the first mission that we left on that deployment, we were in fights. In fact, the first time we were out, we were doing Apache gun runs. We killed high value targets, things like this. And every single time we were outside the fob, there's a gunfight. Again, the Taliban held this area. We had to push them out. Morale was high. We were doing good. Everything was going well. We had the upper hand on the fights pretty much the entire time. So while we were doing that out there, we were trying to bond with all the locals. So when we started winning out there, the locals were very receptive to our presence. They thought, man, these guys are actually going to win. We'll side with them, right? So again, we would go out, they'd offer us tea, they'd offer us bread, even though they had nothing. The level of hospitality seemed odd to some people because they hadn't been to Afghanistan, that they were basically told everybody hates you there, right? They realized that that was wrong later on. Most of the people did not hate us. We would set up security positions and locals would bring their children up to us for medical care. We would use our female engagement teams to talk to Afghan women to see if there's anything we could specifically help them with. Infertility was one of them, helping them try and figure out how to have children and timing and things like that. They felt comfortable telling us where the Taliban was moving so we could set up small kill teams at night on them. All of this, they were doing this while still being threatened. And we developed a connection with them. It pained us when we found out that foreign fighters had come into the area to try and rally the Taliban troops and had gone through and kidnapped a lot of the kids. They would tell the parents that they had to shoot at us to get their kids back. Sometimes they would threaten to strap explosives on them if they talked to us. That just fueled our drive to get them out of the area. We connected with these people. We felt sad that they were getting treated like this. We wanted to push them.
Where are they coming in out of?
These were from Turkey. Eventually, I mean, they liked us so much, they even would invite us over to their feasts during Ramadan. So these guys would fast all day, they could eat at night. So they'd have these really big feasts at night. We even got invited out to those feasts for Ramadan. Majority of the Afghan people were great people and things to be going well. Things were going well. I'm going to skip a little bit because I want to make sure we hit a big part of what we're going on. So leaving the army, I knew after my second deployment I was going to leave the army. Everybody has a big plan when they leave the army. My plan was to become a federal law enforcement officer till I retired. That plan didn't work out, but I was able to find another path. There are things that infantry soldiers experience when they get out. The first thing is that you miss the brotherhood. You spend years of your life with 30 other guys that are your closest friend all day, every day, and now they aren't in your life. You can text them, you can see their posts on Facebook, but it's not the same as being in the company area with them all day. Even though that isn't fun, one of the biggest issues the combat vets have is their social skills with civilians. We develop a very dark sense of humor as a coping mechanism. So we don't feel bad about killing people. We joke about shooting people. We joke about what it looked like. We laugh at others' pain. This doesn't sit well with most people, and it probably shouldn't. There was more than one time that my wife would bring me around friends and it would make it awkward with comments and jokes that I thought were hysterical. It would be hysterical around infantry friends, but it was not. We also have a hard time shaking our training. While we were overseas, we needed to be hyper alert to threats in order to live. This is ingrained to our every fiber while we serve. That doesn't just stop at a flip of a switch. In fact, there are still times I catch myself doing this. When I walk into somewhere new, I tend to look and start counting the exits. I'll look for choke points. I'll scan high threat areas. I still get anxious if I sit with my back to the door at restaurants. These are habits that are hard to shake no matter how long you've been able to wind down. Another big issue for veterans is a sense of guilt for surviving. That doesn't stop when you get out. Since leaving the Army, I've had 4 friends commit suicide and 3 die in combat. These deaths hit us hard since we feel like we could have done something to save them. It most likely wouldn't have mattered, but we can't shake that feeling. We still have the dumb paratrooper mentality of not showing we hurt. When friends die, we play it off, but inside we're ate up. When we have physical pains, we think it's normal because for years it was. I've learned recently it's not normal to have severe back pain at the age of 30. One thing that really helps is getting around other vets. So I try and go on hunting trips and things like that every year, which leads me to coming to St. Francis. So it was one hunting trip that kind of led me to St. Francis. I was hunting in Oklahoma with a good friend of mine from the 82nd Airborne. We were sitting in a blind and doing what all veterans do when they hang out, which is bring up all the old stories. We got to the point where we were talking about some of the really crazy things that happened overseas. The ones that stood out were a mortar landing on a soldier's foot, but not exploding. There was somebody stepping on an anti-personnel mine that have 5 gallons of homemade explosives underneath it. The blasting cap going off, but the charge not going off. So we lived. We also had times where soldiers were getting shot at. There's just bullets flying over their head. We had a sniper shoot 7 of our soldiers, but somehow they all hit the plates. There were times when we were standing right next to IEDs and we watched Taliban fighters try and set them off and they didn't go off. Every time we would tell a story like this, we'd just say, oh, it wasn't their time. After a while, it kind of dawned on me, maybe an epiphany during Epiphany season here,
Well done.
that if we believe that it's not our time or it was just their time, and we believe in this logic, and most of us really, really did, that there's got to be something controlling our fate, kind of like maybe God. That's when I decided to tell Maddie that I wanted to go to church more. She agreed, and we decided to go to the closest church. We live up in the Arbors. So we were lazy. You're like, there's a church right there. Let's try it, right? So this happened to be St. Francis. And from day one, the hospitality, kindness, and openness of this church has been extraordinary. And I feel blessed to have found it. All the crazy experiences, negativity, depression, highs, lows, alcohol consumption, fighting, and decisions somehow led me to God. I didn't grow up in a household that went to church very often. I didn't consider myself very religious, but seeing what I did in the military ended up growing my faith. I want to touch on Afghan refugees just a little bit here. Last year, we saw the US pull out of Afghanistan. There's a lot of mixed emotions for me when that happened, but in general, I felt bad for those we were leaving behind. I worked with some really great interpreters, a few good Afghan Army guys. I knew their lives were now in great danger. We had a huge network of people helping us, from interpreters to intel sources, Afghan National Army, the National Police, government officials, and base workers. They started being hunted even before the summer of 2021. As we closed down bases starting in 2014, we started losing ground to the Taliban. Without US forces in the area, the Army and the police had a hard time controlling the major towns. When Ghazni fell, which is where I deployed in my second deployment, in 2018, the US sent a large amount of special operations forces to retake the city. Eventually, they were able to push them far enough to keep supply routes open, but it was short-lived. As soon as we left again, the city was taken before it did. This happened in many large cities around Afghanistan, even before 2021. One of the reasons Afghanistan fell so quickly is because people didn't realize how much territory the Taliban truly had. They were able to kind of take it from within and keep it a secret. Our intelligence gatherers thought, well, we have forces there, we'll be fine. And talking about Afghan forces, they were not fine. Areas that would fall to the Taliban they would start hunting the people that helped us. If they could find them, they would kill them in very brutal ways. This was to show people that they shouldn't help us and shouldn't support us. As the entire country fell to the Taliban, more and more ANA, Afghan army and police troops fled for their safety. This left even more allies in danger because they had nobody to help protect them. Those who were in Kabul or Kandahar might be able to get a flight out of the country, where they could work on the paperwork to get citizenship to the US or to Europe. Those in the rural areas, though, would have to brave driving to Kabul on the one road that heads there. It's very easy to put up roadblocks and checkpoints on one road to find people. When they were trying to leave their province, they would either be turned around or shot. Even those that made it to Kabul didn't necessarily make it out. We all saw the videos and pictures of people running after the planes, trying to grab onto them. They were desperate because we didn't have the capacity to get everybody out. For 20 years, we told Afghans we were the good guys. If they helped us, we would bring peace. We promised to help them and make their lives better. That mission doesn't stop just because the military occupation has ended. That mission doesn't, there are still private efforts to get those out who are seeking asylum. But things are slow. They have to have money and resources to bribe officials, to get paperwork, to find flights, to provide security. A lot of the people working on the ground have been captured as well. I know personally, one group that was working to get some people out had an intel source from Britain on the ground who'd been in Afghanistan for 40 years. He's now in jail. That organization is shut down. They have no way to get people out. Even those that have made it out of the country do not face an easy transition. Some will be stuck in refugee camps for months until they can get proper documentation to get to Europe or the US. Those that make it to Europe or the US are faced with major culture shock. A lot of them have never seen a Walmart or a 4-lane interstate, flown on a plane, or even just been out of their own country or their own province for that matter. They may not speak English well enough to communicate properly. The food is not what they're used to. It's going to be extremely overwhelming. Who here has traveled overseas? Have you ever been to a place where you land and like, what the heck is this? How do I read these signs? How do I get to places? What is this weird looking food in a grocery store? Now think of you've never seen a supermarket. You've never been to a grocery store. You've only grown and cultivated your food. And now you're coming to the US. One common theme I've seen at St. Francis since day one of coming here is hospitality. Everybody here was very hospitable to us when we were the new kids. Lori was briefed that her hospitality was second to none when she was coming to take over as vicar. She preaches about her hospitality and why it's a great thing for us to be hospitable to those around us. My personal experience is that Afghans were some of the most hospitable people we ever met, the ones that we didn't fight. Oh, caveat there, right? They treated soldiers better than they get treatment from the VA sometimes, even when it meant they could face death threats. It's time for everyone, including St. Francis, to return the favor. Next week, you're going to see a presentation specifically geared towards Afghan refugees coming to the area. We should all pay attention and find out how to help. I challenge everybody here and on Zoom and those who watch this later on, find out how you can help. That might be a food donation, a monetary donation, donating time. Whatever it is, if everybody helps even just a little bit, we can make a massive difference to those coming here. We only have 1 minute, so I wanted to make sure we got through that portion of it. Does anybody want to bring up any questions, comments? I'm glad it wasn't too short.
Are there any donation links you could recommend to people?
I can. If people are interested in links to donate either to organizations that are trying to help people get out, I have links that I can give people off on the side. Also, the the organization that's coming here next week, they will
Welcome
specifically
Neighbor.
take donations to help with refugees coming in this area as well. So
Welcome Neighbor, and I'd love to get those links from you and we'll
Mm-hmm.
share them in our newsletter. Our hope had been that Welcome Neighbor, who works not only with Afghan refugees, but all refugees in the St. Louis area, so Syrian and other African nations as well, and helps them to lean into that piece of their culture that's so important, food, and to get licensed in order to be a food preparer, a licensed food worker, so that they can then share their culture through stomach, through taste and through filling. And what better way to earn an income, to have a piece of home, and to share about their culture to the St. Louis area. So that's part of Welcome Neighbor's mission. Our hope had been that this stupid COVID thing would have kept getting better and better, and that we would have Welcome Neighbors serving our normal annual meeting meal. But another year, another time. But there are many links, and I actually put one in this week's newsletter to Welcome Neighbor. Just go through, drive through, order the food, and so at any rate, we'll share Nathan's link. We'll share ours. Anything else? We have probably time for one question or comment. Oh, yep, Donna, go ahead.
Just a quick comment. I think we ought to have a chairman for this kind of thing that can help get people organized in how to do it. It's just a thought.
Okay.
And I know who the chairman would be, Mr. Whaley.
Yeah, well, hold on, let me show you Madeline's belly.
we're gonna be quite busy.
Maybe next year, maybe next year. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
On behalf of the people of St. Francis, I just want to thank you so much, Nathan, for sharing this story. It's so powerful. And you mentioned, the hospitality. But the other reason I felt drawn to St. Francis was because it is a place that does nuance. It is not, we only see, all the people here see things one particular way. And I was drawn to a place where people are formed together in the body of Christ, even though there are a number of different perspectives. And I think what you shared today shows how there is not this way or that way, that this is a deeply complicated issue, and that some of the people who are our enemy actually show us the greatest love, and that it is just so deeply nuanced and complicated.
Absolutely.
So, but your vulnerability and sharing this with us is just absolutely the greatest gift. Thank you.
You're welcome.